This conference will now be recorded.
Including you. Ani Abjogi Naomi Tom. Good evening, everybody. My name is Naomi Tom. I'm the Curator of Education with HimDoc. Thank you all for joining us this evening for our third lecture in our summer lecture series. We'll go ahead and get started. Before we go ahead and get started, just to let you all know, so your cameras and your microphones have been disabled. That way we're not interrupting our presenter this evening. But please feel free to use the chat to have conversations with each other, ask questions and comments. I'll go ahead and collect them. And when we get towards the end of our presentation, we'll go over those with our presenter. Then, so just a brief introduction, and I'll let Dr. Kreikemeier do a more thorough introduction. So, hi, welcome. It's good to see you remotely. One of these days we'll meet each other in person.
Looking
So,
forward.
this evening we have Dr. Alys Kreikemeier. She is a postdoc fellow at the University of New Mexico, recently earned her PhD in American Studies, and I'll let her go into a little bit more about that. But I am very excited and happy that she is here to join us to talk about the work that she recently did. So I'll go ahead and I'll stop and I'll let you take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Naomi. I look forward to being able to meet you in person as well and really appreciate the invitation to share this work tonight. So thank you everyone for coming. Um, as Naomi said, my name is Alyssa. I go by Ali Kreikemeier, and I'm speaking to you tonight from my home where I live on Tewa land in what we call today Santa Fe, New Mexico. And I'd like to just start with some thanks, and then I'll say a little bit about myself and introduce the talk. But I'd really like to thank Ms. Naomi Tom, as well as Ms. Beverly Johnson, who I did get to meet when I was able to visit the Imdaki Museum and Visitor Center this summer. And I'd also like to thank the Tohono O'odham IRB. I'm not a community member of the nation. I'm an outside white settler scholar. And so the process, I'll talk a bit about sort of how I've come to this work, but I just have tremendous respect and gratitude for the way the Institutional Review Board has put together a process for researchers whose work addresses or covers aspects of the nation or any of its people or culture or history to do that in right relationship and maintain the authority over who and how that research is done, which of course is always important, but I think especially as an outsider who's not a member of the community and recognizing such a long history where outside researchers have been incredibly destructive and extractive when doing research with Indigenous communities. So those stakes are really high and important. And so the process then, this is part of my dissertation research. The broader dissertation is called Aerial Empire Contested Sovereignties in the American West, and it's interested in a few different case studies. So tonight I'm focusing on one. I look at a few other tribes throughout Montana and New Mexico as well, and their cases and how efforts to manage the atmosphere as a natural resource mediated relations between Native nations and the federal government in the late 20th century. I think it's sort of wonderful to see it seems like it's just, in some sense, it seems absurd to try and put boundaries and control the atmosphere and reduce it to something that can be sort of measured and commodified and mapped in the way the settler state has done with all the lands across the continent. And so air captured my interest as something that's particularly difficult to do, or really sheds light on the limitations of these settler efforts to control this broad, complex environment that is our home of Earth. And so across these cases, what I found was that they cover the 20th century, but that really these new policies aimed at controlling and managing the atmosphere, managing air as a natural resource, both extended settler control and sort of the colonial structures that govern, of course, the nation state, the settler state to this day over the atmosphere. But it also created a new arena where tribes expressed their sovereignty and were able to leverage new kinds of laws and environmental policy to demand and receive greater recognition of their inherent sovereignty from the federal government. So that's the bigger project. And the talk I'm going to be giving today then is about the overflights. So let me share my screen and I can get into the background. Let me see. There it is. Okay, cool. I think this is what I want us to see. Great. So this is a chapter from the dissertation research I completed in American Studies and Environmental History about the overflights above the Tohono O'odham Nation. And as I mentioned, I just want to say a little bit more by way of introducing and getting into the talk tonight, that the Institutional Review Board, or the IRB, has, I think, a really fabulous process for researchers to express their interest in doing the work. So I was able to work with the IRB to develop my methods, and I really appreciated the ways that the process of gaining consent to do this research required me to express some understanding and engagement, although there's a great limit to what I can really know as someone who's not a community member, about the history and culture of O'odham people. So I like to start, and I have given this talk to other audiences as well, and I like to start with this slide that may be familiar to you there on the Nation, that I have borrowed gratefully from the community college, describing IMDUC, which was something that I had to be able to do in order to ask permission to do this research. And I feel like it's important for the talk. One, I'd like to talk about what it means to do work and research with permission and in relationship with tribal government. Often I'm talking to an audience of other scholars, or settler scholars, or people interested in this work. But I think especially for this talk, which is going to read more like a kind of academic conversation from my research, which I should say was done through documentary evidence. The majority was done during COVID. So my methods were really the written sources that I'll share, and which come from the archive, and this project stops in the 1990s. So that's where I was able to do research on the overflights I'm interested in, the process of beginning to develop a part 2. And so I hope we'll get to talk about that in the discussion, or be able to invite any interest or comments about bringing this research up from the 90s to today, because I understand the overflights are still occurring, and I think there's some really important work to be done, and that will require another proposal and process, and a different kind of process to figure out how I might be able to engage and do some interviews and work more closely with the community. But the research I'm sharing tonight came from written sources. So you'll see that, and I'd like to say, by way of acknowledging that I am doing my best, and I will do my best and have to pronounce names correctly and to get the story right, but I completely welcome and would really appreciate any feedback or corrections, as it's incredibly challenging and fraught to do this as an outsider. And also the story here is incredibly important for O'odham people, but also for many more Americans. So I feel like it's important to do, and I want to do it well and improve along the way. So I like to start with just acknowledging what IMDUG means, this way of life, culture, and values that are really uniquely held by O'odham people and culture, and that it really incorporates everything in life that is unique about the Tohono O'odham people, the lifelong journey. And as this slide really lovely presents from the community college, this includes arts, beliefs, community, traditional foods and hunting, language, land, environment, seasons, so the air, the atmosphere, elements, all in this really holistic way as part of Himdag, the medicinal plants, mobility, past, future, relatives, songs, storytelling, spirituality and religion, values, and sensitivity. And so I think that understanding the ways that these aspects of Himdag are interwoven in Tohono O'odham people and culture and history really drives home just how the overflights assaulted the very, and continue to, I think, assault the really core of the Tohono O'odham people. It's not just an issue of jurisdiction or geography or policy, but there's this profound kind of harm that these flights are related to. And so I think acknowledging and at least expressing some understanding of Himdag helps to drive that home. So I'm also going to start with a brief exercise or invitation. Before getting into kind of sharing information, I want to just give us a minute to pause and to take a breath wherever you are. And you might just notice how the breath enters your nostrils or rises in your belly. And then moving from the sensations of your mouth and your body to just begin to notice. And maybe I'm going to have to screen share again, but I would like to invite you to just put a few things in the chat. Just notice what you hear. So it's fairly quiet in my home office, but I can hear a sort of buzzing of the electricity and some traffic outside. Heartbeat, that's wonderful. A ceiling fan, great. Traffic, AC, the noise and presence of dogs or a dog. So far mine is quiet. Hopefully that stays that way. Just take a minute, even if you don't want to place them in the chat, just take one more minute to just kind of sit and notice what you hear. Wind, trees. So I like to start with this brief exercise to remind us that the air, which, in the process of my talk is really something that the records and the Air Force think about in terms of airspace and a natural resource and political borders, but it's really the same breath that connects us with our surroundings and all the other life forms, whether it's the animals, the other humans we hear, the infrastructure that we inhabit. And I feel like that's a really important just reminder as we get in, as I want to get into my talk of the stakes of the air and how we relate to it. All right, so thank you for noticing our breath. I invite you to do that throughout the talk. But I'm going to start with a story from 1975. So this is a story from my research. And it was I believe it was the summer of 1975, when a woman, Miss Delamar Fast Horse, was simply at home, in her home at uncovered wells on the nation, and she heard a loud boom. So she ran out of the room when she heard this loud boom out of the middle of nowhere, and noticed that in the hallway of her home, there was a large crack through the wall, and the light fixture had totally fallen off the wall. So damage caused by a sonic boom, which was a part of the impact of these military overflights. They had been going on for a while, and the Air Force was in the process of actually investigating what the impacts of their militarized airspace is on the nation. And so there was a process in place for making a claim with the Air Force. I believe there still is today. And despite the fact that engineers visited her home and saw the damage, they ultimately denied Ms. Fast Horse's claim. So I like to open with this story and really just, we'll get into the backstory, but this was a period, and this is still going on. But really in the 70s, there was a huge uptick in the number of sonic booms and the ways that they totally rattled O'odham homes, but also schools and churches, causing property damage, and let alone the aerial harassment and trespass of the use of this airspace by the Air Force. So for a little orientation, forgive the map on the left here. I just took from Google Maps currently, and it's obviously very, very rough. So I apologize, it's not the most accurate, but I like what I like about this map is, you can see the kind of colonial US map. We're covering the whole Southwest from California through New Mexico, a part of Sonora in Mexico, and you see really the scope and scale of the ancestral Autumn homelands. So you can see within it the current boundaries of the nation. But I want to start by this contextualization of just the wide homelands that have claimed since time immemorial. And then the map on the right, I apologize, it's also not terribly easy to read, but it was made in the early 20th century and includes all the place names.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt, but we're not seeing your screen, we're
Oh,
seeing you.
interrupting.
Yeah.
Here I am looking closely at my screen. You're seeing my nostrils. That's not what we want. How can you see it now?
Yeah, I see the entire screen. Yeah.
Is this now the presentation?
Mhm. There it is. Okay,
The
you're
map.
good.
Thank you. I apologize about
You're
that.
welcome.
Great. So again, here's that map kind of roughly showing ancestral lands in comparison to the broader region. And then this map, which again is hard to read, but I like because it names all of the different place names, and it was made in the early 20th century. It also shows just how much of this homeland covers into what is now a international border that came when the kind of second wave of US settler colonists after the Spanish arrived established the international boundary. It's also a good reminder that Papago is a word that has been used to refer to Autumn people. It's not the word they refer to themselves. So I use the word Tohono O'odham, but it will show up occasionally in sources and on the screen. So that's what that was referred to at the time. So then a map of the bases. So these flights are emerging from Air Force bases that were established in the 1940s. They were established as the US was gearing up for World War II and needed to train a bunch of pilots to do so. Again, these are contemporary, so this map I think is telling, although the three Air Force bases that I'll be talking about from which these flights overfly, the Sells military operating airspace, which is the focus of my talk, these are from Luke Williams and Davis Monthan. But I think it's telling just how many military sites and Air Force bases there are in the broader area. And the map to the left, a colleague made for me, and you can see all of this is different airspace. So again, there's a lot of this air has been militarized. But in the case of the CELS MOA, which is what I focus on, and MOA refers to a military operating airspace, it covers almost the entirety of the nation. And then when you extend it with these others, there's a firing range, and it's one of the largest sort of extensive military airspaces across what is today the US. So I'm going to be focusing specifically on the CELS military operating airspace, which is also a low altitude airspace, which is what makes some of these flights so intense and appalling, and really trespassing through the nation's air because they fly quite low. So these bases were established during World War II and then continued to be in use after the war ended in 1945. And I just want to step back and give a little national context for sonic booms. So in 1951, the Federal Aviation Administration permitted the Air Force to train below 18,000 feet in the CELS MOA, so dropping how close they could train to the ground. But sonic booms, so at that point there would have been a lot of flights. Sonic booms were still fairly rare. The technology for jets didn't fly that quick. It wasn't that easy or that common, and that increases a lot by the 70s and 80s, which is why I focus on that time period. So that's all happening through the military, but in fact, during the 1960s, the US sought to create a supersonic transport program that would be commercially viable, in essence, to compete with Britain's Concorde. So the goal was jets were still fairly new at that time, jet travel, and the goal was to actually develop supersonic jets. And so as a part of that, there were several overflights that the federal government tested. The most notorious ones were in 1964 over Oklahoma City. I think we saw someone calling in from there. But this was like, oh, let me check my notes. I think it was 1,000, yeah, 1,000 booms a day for 12 weeks is what the supersonic program had planned. And so the idea was to really concentrate them and see is the supersonic boom something that Americans will just accept as they've come to accept the noise of aviation or of automobile transport as a kind of facet of modern life to be able to travel or not. And in fact, a judge immediately placed an injunction on the flights, and then they continued, but they were shut down early. They caused a lot of damage to homes and buildings, and residents of Oklahoma City weren't having it. So by 1960, be clear that the population wouldn't withstand sonic booms, that they caused too much damage and were far too harmful. The protest continued, so the program was still continuing. There's a real strong impulse to compete with Britain, but increasingly environmentalists protested these booms. As after the Oklahoma City overflights, they were concentrated over a national park land, and the Secretary of Interior, Stuart Udall, actually launched an investigation. Um, and so then that the protest continued, and ultimately there was enough kind of public protest against supersonic booms that the program to develop commercial transit ended in 1971. So I think this is important that by 1973 the program to develop this commercially had completely ended, and in fact the Federal Aviation Administration had banned flights over land entirely. Of course, they continued in military airspaces, and especially in those airspaces were concentrated often over indigenous lands. There's another important context for this, which is nascent environmental legislation. So there was a National Environmental Policy Act, often referred to as NEPA, which required environmental assessments from federal agencies. So what's important about this is for the first time, the Air Force, which certainly had been hearing the protests from O'odham people about their militarized airspace and protests elsewhere as well, had to actually do the research and account for how their use of this airspace was affecting the environment, the populations living in that environment, and they drafted an environmental impact statement, or an EIS, which is that reporting on the impact of the cell's military operating airspace. So that's the real source. The main source for the research I've done is the statements and the public hearings that were all recorded by the Air Force, which I think is telling, to see the kinds of stories so clearly that the Air Force itself had captured. So it's a complicated archival question for me as well, because these are colonial documents. They were recorded from the Air Force, and so I think I take that with a grain of salt, and I want to do a second round of research. But I also think that the story they tell, it's quite remarkable, which I'll get to in a moment. I'm going to share bits from those stories. So essentially what happened was the Air Force had to collect some information about the impact of the airspace, and then it shared a draft of this EIS with the Tohono O'odham Nation, as well as other communities and surrounding communities, other federal agencies, and then they scheduled public hearings. And so there were 2 hearings that were held. After the first hearing, the Air Force went away, took in the information from community members and other agencies, revised the environmental impact statement, and then once that was done, they held another hearing. And so I'm going to be sharing some stories and comments from community members at those hearings today. Meanwhile, again, the protests had likely been going on for decades before, to be sure, but there were some events in the 70s with technology that made the overflights even more invasive. And so in the record, in the written record, there is clear indication of the nation petitioning the FAA multiple times, first at least for at least in 1975, likely before then, but that's what I found in the documents. And then again in 1977. The Tohono O'odham also sent a delegation to the Pentagon and met with officials at the Pentagon, expressing their protest of the use of their airs and airspace this way. And Morris Udall, who was a state representative at the time, I believe, or senator, I think he was a rep, he also contacted the FAA about the overflights. So in the 1970s, a bunch of A-10 attack jets arrived at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base. They didn't create more sonic booms, but what occurred is there was increasingly jets that could fly and create sonic booms, and then there were jets like A-10s that could maneuver like 40, 50 feet above ground at times, which is quite terrifying as they're doing their low altitude maneuvers. Meanwhile, although the Air Force actually had begun its environmental impact statement and had, all of this experience of protest from Tohono O'odham people, they lowered the flight ceiling from 500 feet above ground, which is already quite low, to just 100 feet. And then I'm going to go into the hearings that they held first in 1979 and next in 1986. So in 1979, the Air Force had created its draft statement of the impact of the airspace. It circulated it to Tohono O'odham members, and then it held a hearing at Santa Rosa School to hear from the community about their responses to the report that the Air Force made. Meanwhile, or just a few weeks before, residents in Tucson were outraged when a sonic boom, which actually originated over the nation, could be felt in the city. And so at that first hearing, Mark Caldwell, who was legal counsel for the Tohono O'odham Nation, referred to the Tucson frustration and said, quote, "What you're really saying is that the Papago Reservation can be used as a dumping ground for urban expansion. I think that shows that the Papago people are being forced to pay the price for other people's benefits." And according to the EIS, so this is again the Air Force's own data, they noted that the nation, areas on the nation could experience up to 19 booms per day. At that first meeting, Ms. Harriet Toro described the damage that was done and accused the Air Force of child abuse. She criticized the agency for breaking flight patterns, which we'll see more evidence of. And she spoke directly to the colonel saying, "What's more, I want to see all flight patterns outside our reservation boundaries. I want them to go to the outside and let the other people see what effects have occurred to our own and see how they like it and how they will react." She told the Air Force representatives at the hearing that the overflights constituted simply the latest chapter in a long history of U.S. efforts to assimilate and terminate us. And now see, she said to them, now we're witnessing another modern day technique of trying to strip us of what little we have left. But I care for my people, I care for the air and the earth and the animals. And I want to say that I will continuously object to some of the things that you are doing. Ms. Toro linked the overflights with a longer pattern of colonization and with the government, quote, trying to wipe us out, not only physically, but spiritually. At the hearing, Mark Caldwell objected to how the colonel conducted the meeting, which was supposed to be led by the tribal chairman. However, accordingly, sort of took over leading it and imposed really strict time limits on comments from the community. There were upwards of 500 that came. At that hearing, Ms. Delmar Fasthorse, who we heard briefly about one of her experiences, she shared in the hearing about 2 subsequent sonic booms. So right after each other, 2 occurred and damaged her home. And the Air Force concluded that it was settling, like from the house naturally settling, that caused this damage, although 2 of the personnel were there and actually witnessed the boom with her in her house. So what she said to the colonel is, I'm trying to point out here that they had their own engineer there to inspect it. Why couldn't they get a civilian engineer who would have been impartial to both of us? She asked Colonel Smith. Captain King, who represented the claims office at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base, responded that a civilian engineer on their payroll would be equally problematic. He sort of dodged the question and told Fasthorse that she could always hire her own lawyer. Molly Garcia, as a tribal councilwoman, stated that it should be up to the people themselves to decide what it is they want. And she turned and addressed Air Force representatives directly, saying, it seems that you people don't seem to think very much of us. This isn't just a big flat area. This is the ancestral homeland of the Papago people. There was a doctor from the Sells Hospital named Bob Cairns, and he spoke on behalf of the hospital and medical staff. He noted similarities to his time in Vietnam as an Army medic and really described an experience akin to being in a war zone. He talked about how sonic booms rattled rooms where doctors were tending to patients and even conducting procedures. And Cairns was concerned that the report had completely ignored any psychological impacts. Again, he had been in Vietnam and was acutely aware of what this did to people's health and bodies. He described his own experience of being buzzed by a low fighter jet. He said, "I was surprised, I was scared. My gut reaction was the same that I might have had 9 or 10 years ago, as if he had had a PTSD flashback perhaps. But here I am," he said. "There's no war going on here." Another speaker commented, "Maybe you can check back and find out who is zeroing in on us and tell them we're not Vietnamese." Rosemary Lopez spoke first in Autumn and then in English. There were interpreters and translators. She described visiting the Pentagon as part of that group, and apparently the Pentagon told her they'd look into the matter, but then there was no ultimate response. So Ms. Lopez described the impact of sonic booms on her family and on her child. She said, "We're not Vietnamese. We are not your enemies. Our people have served the United States in wars. We need something done for us in return." She continued, "I want to make this statement. I think the Air Force is committing a psychological rape to our people. I've heard of psychological death. I feel this is psychological rape to our people." Brennan Harvey asked the captains, did they know how low their pilots were flying, and that they could be found buzzing schools and homes within areas where flight was restricted. He described watching planes fly below 100 feet over the village of Papawa, clearly circled as a no-fly zone. And this map comes from the report the Air Force did. So I'm sorry that the text is hard to read, but you can see how many of these circles over villages indicated that no flights were meant to be occurring below 3,000 feet in any of these areas. If this happened, the major replied to Mr. Harvey, residents should record the time, the place, the type of aircraft, and then report the incident. With this information, they could track down the pilot, he said. Maybe the pilot was lost, the major replied. Harvey answered, all right, but I see these guys going over, usually there's 2 of them. Are they both lost? Multiple residents at that hearing asked why the EIS didn't address the psychological, spiritual, and emotional impacts, and they also asked whether they had consulted with tribal experts in trying to understand the impact of these overflights. The Air Force had not. Ms. Harriet Toro asked if the airplanes flying close to their homes and to the schools carried bombs, and Lieutenant Colonel Boucher replied that they did in fact from time to time. When speakers asked why it was their land that was used for these flights, the Colonel Smith replied, it just happened that when the airplanes started going faster than sound, they were based at these locations. Essentially, it's an accident of geography. And yet, I don't really know how to change the geography or Arizona, note he didn't mention the Tohono O'odham Nation, or the placement of bases now. Robert Cruz had read about an agreement between the Air Force and the tribe, he said, that allowed the military access to O'odham land simply during World War II, and it was supposed to end then. He asked, can you answer when the Second World War ended? Is it still going on? This is in 1979. The Air Force said they could not provide an official answer, though Colonel Smith replied, my personal opinion is that the war has been declared over, but we'll take that question and we'll get an answer back to you, Robert. So after the 1979 hearing, the Air Force spent 7 years revising their report. To do so, they compiled responses from Tohono O'odham residents, as well as other communities and federal agencies. And across the board, comments showed that their initial environmental impact statement was insufficient, that it didn't actually do thorough enough research to understand what the impact of airspace was. Meanwhile, as they are apparently revising the report, there were 2 fighter jets that collided in 1982 on the reservation, killing one pilot and injuring 2 others. And the vice chairman at the time, Francisco Zay, made a statement in response saying, "What really concerns me is that the planes were out of control and that it seemed like the Air Force went out of their way to scare people." And this map is also from the impact statement that the Air Force compiled in 1979, and each of these airplane figures indicates a crash. So crashes were also a serious hazard. In 1982, there was an incident where a series of low-flying jets elicited sonic booms over the village of Baichin, and they were flying a mere 200 feet above the ground, over 50 homes. As the pilots flew low, televisions burst throughout different homes, windows were shattered. And after the overflight, residents' ears wouldn't start ringing. Many experienced hearing loss for days after, and at least 15 patients were seen by doctors who had hearing loss and damage to their ears. In response to the incident, which was covered by multiple newspapers, the Air National Guard commander, John Hartnett, denied that the flights had caused any damage, and it was part of a joint military training exercise. Meanwhile, the legal services attorney for the nation described the damage done to at least 11 homes, and he told reporters they're making it very difficult to nail down who is responsible for these flights. So by 1986, the Air Force, 7 years later, came back with a revised environmental impact statement. And after they shared it with the Tohono O'odham Nation and other affected communities and agencies, they once again scheduled hearings. So the next hearing was in 1986. Across the board, again, and even the regional EPA, Environmental Policy Administration administrator, the one responsible for overseeing environmental impact statements, classified the report as insufficient. That federal environmental agency was concerned that the report minimized the health impacts of overflights and that it had excluded the exposed population in some analyses. Papago Legal Services sent a written response to the Air Force about the revised report, saying, for example, if one would be forced to spend an entire day with a gun next to one's ear, which could go off at any moment, any number of times, at an unexpected intervals, the harm would not only be the shock of the actual sound, but also the fear and anxiety caused by the expectation of that shock. It is this sort of fear and anxiety and ever-present harm that the revised environmental impact statement failed to make a detailed statement about. So once again, just ignoring the tremendous different ways in which these overflights caused harm. They also replied with a written transcript of the first hearing, which the Air Force had somehow forgotten to include at all in their revised impact statement. So the tribe shared the document that the Air Force produced and was supposed to be including in its revised environmental impact statement. The Air Force scheduled the hearing within a month of sharing the report with the Tohono O'odham Nation, and the tribal chairman responded immediately, describing the importance of holding a meeting that would be accessible as possible. To do so, he pushed back the hearing several weeks, declaring that if the Air Force could take over 6 years to revise the EIS, that a few more weeks were necessary for the nation. And at that time, 4 years later, residents in Baichin were still waiting for a response to their claims for the disastrous overflights that happened in 1982. So when Air Force officials met for the second public hearing, once again, they were at Santa Rosa School, and Tohono O'odham residents came, but only about 50, and there were over 500 at the first hearing. However, many others did send letters, and I think the indication in numbers is really reflective of perhaps a loss or a wearing down of energy to participate in the process, given the way the Air Force had been running it. But there were many letters as well, including students from San Simon who regularly experienced low altitude flights and sonic booms. One of these students wrote, "Please don't fly your supersonic jets over the O'odham Reservation. They break windows, scare the animals, and we don't want the bombs. Goodbye." Students described their hurting ears and they asked for peace and quiet. So at that second meeting in 1986, Colonel Pat Sweeney opened the meeting, and Vice Chairman Francisco Jose took the floor. He immediately reminded listeners of the first public hearing 7 years earlier, when he and other residents expressed strong objections and concerns regarding the sonic booms and the numerous overflights across the nation. He also reminded people who were in attendance of the many people who came, and those, some of whom had already passed on by the time the second hearing occurred. This time, for attendance to speak, the Air Force required them to fill out a white card from a stack at the back of the room. According to the colonel, this would allow the Air Force to follow up by collecting contact information, but it certainly added another barrier to community members being able to speak at the public hearing. Vice Chairman Jose explained the nation's resolution against the overflights. He and the position that at least some had held since the bases were built in the 1940s. While the city of Tucson had passed an ordinance against helicopter noise that constrained flight, the Air Force continued to ignore Tohono O'odham resolution. So there was a legal resolution in place against these overflights. It seems like our comments are in vain, he said. What I'm saying is that my people have suffered long enough, and they wish not to continue to suffer from that. The sonic booms that hit upon this nation are like gunshots. They are like gunshots early in the morning or late at night. At that second hearing, Eugene Ennis spoke about, he spoke and stated clearly residents' opposition to the military airspace. Mr. Ennis asked, "Is this going to go on, whether we oppose it or not? How much more proof do you need from the people here opposing this project?" Mr. Ennis continued, "Many of you non-Indians that are here today have learned an education. I know I have. And I think many of you will go home now, wherever you come from, and you'll at least remember that we haven't just sat back and said nothing. We want negotiations with the United States Air Force. You are going to be around until the end of the world, but so are we." After the comment period ended for that second hearing, it turned to a question and answer session. Tony Felix, who was a member of tribal government, affirmed that sonic booms impacted health, and he noted that no studies had been done to consider the specific effects of sonic booms on Indigenous Americans. Mr. Felix addressed crashes on the reservation, and he closed his comments reminding the Air Force that the tribe is a sovereign nation, and they will exercise their sovereignty pertaining to the aircraft that is on the ground, even though it may be federal property. Air Force representatives acknowledged that noise pollution caused physical stress, but they used inconclusive research on its long-term effects to undermine the concern. Luke Air Force Base Colonel Joseph Risley summarized the environmental impact statement and the Air Force's position. "Noise is annoying," he told the nation's residents. "At times, the noise of our aircraft may upset you. Again, we hope we have taken steps to alleviate that." To reduce this quote-unquote annoyance, Risley said the Air Force would restrict flights to 3,000 feet above ground, except in training routes, and that it would use supersonic training areas. Remember, some of these agreements had been in place, and residents described the overflights that directly ignored them. When that second hearing concluded, the Air Force acknowledged clearly that the local populace perceived significant impacts on lifestyle, but asserted that their report found, quote, "no significant impacts on socioeconomic or health aspects." As such, they determined to continue using the low altitude airspace. By 1986, that same year of the second hearing, military airspace covered 1/3 of landmass. So I think it's really telling to think about how this is another arena for imperial harassment, and to look at the particular places, often larger tribal areas and native nations in the West. And you can see how much of this is concentrated here and then down around the cells. There was a general environmental impact statement the Air Force did in 1990, and I think this is really interesting and complicated, and perhaps shows the ambivalence of sort of colonial ambiguity in relationship with sovereign native nations. So the Air Force, I think, I haven't seen any direct evidence in the archive, but it seems to me that the really clear concerted protest by O'odham people for decades was on the Air Force's radar. You know, they chose to ignore in a lot of ways the requests and certainly continued to trespass through sovereign airspace. But I do think the fact that the Air Force, within a few years of the final environmental impact statement of the CELS airspace, did this broader impact statement of low altitude airspace, my hypothesis, or I think that indicates that there was some impact and some real attention based on the, again, really concerted, clear, sustained protests of some Tohono O'odham people. I also think what's interesting is this map shows for this impact statement, so it looked at 12 sites across the US. It was more general for the whole country, and they chose 12. They actually worked specifically with tribes in this one, but they chose 12, none of which include the Tohono O'odham. So even though there was this history and this relationship and plenty of data from O'odham about the overflights, they chose not to focus on cells. That impact statement did explicitly acknowledge that because of, quote, historical circumstances in which Indians have been willfully or negligently misinformed and in which they have been forcibly resettled without just compensation or due process, their experiences will differ from those of people in mainstream America. Again, an understatement, and also it's appearing here in this federal colonial document, which I think is interesting. So that's where my study, my historic study of these overflights ended. But I do think this is really important to continue the work, and would like to hear from any comments or experiences of folks there on the nation about this plan that the Air Force came out with last spring, March of 2022, about extending special use airspace. And so there's a few, I have a website pulled up we can look at, but it's basically an example of dropping flights again and using more of these low altitude airspaces, which include cells, and continue to cover the Autumn Nation. Of course, there have also been additional crashes and ongoing overflights since I ended my talk, or since my historic research ended in the 1990s. So this latest plan is called the Special Use Airspace Optimization Plan, and I don't have much more information other than the plan that came out in the spring. It's something I would like to learn more about in a second phase of research. So to conclude the talk and leave some time for questions, I'll just wrap up with a few kind of open questions that I think are really important, which is how these overflights continue to impact the nation today. And as I mentioned, that's something that I think another round of research that looks at more recent history could be really useful for, and requires developing a study and working more with community members than my research has so far. I'm curious about what accountability and responsibility looks like. When I gave this talk, there was a veteran in the audience who noted delay, and a thing that might be seen as a bureaucratic, like, oh, it takes 7 years for governments. But I actually wonder about delay as a kind of colonial tactic, right? Which means that we can now go back and really clearly look at these documents, publish them, write about them, raise concern. But Colonel Rivley is, where is he at now? So what happens when the delay of these processes that the federal government, apparently undertakes for accountability or to acknowledge or assess its impact? I'm curious about how delay operates there. And then more broadly, to tie it to kind of the larger dissertation project, and I think really urgent questions facing us today with airspace, but also with the climate crisis: what belongs in the air, and who is responsible for what's been put there? In a lot of climate justice conversations, there's an emphasis on China's emissions, but of course it's been emissions from the United States that are most responsible for warming, and then the people who have benefited from the emissions, right, are certain sects of people, of often the higher middle class white settler populations. So I think that that's also where the way that different Indigenous Americans continue to relate with and steward and are using their sovereignty and their ongoing ancestral homelands to offer different ways of relating with the earth is something that's really, really crucial to learn from. So I'll leave it with those kind of bigger questions and just give you all a chance to share any comments or questions. Oh, and I'm sorry, I'm going to go back because I did also want to, I don't know what happened here. Let me see if I can share. I did also want to share my email so that if there's anyone who would like to follow up with further questions, you can get in touch. And maybe I'll just actually type it in the chat. I think that'll be a little bit easier. Okay. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over for comments and questions. And thank you very much for your attention.
Well, thank you. So there's a comment. So please, everyone who has questions, comments, like I said earlier, we disabled the cameras and your sound, but please put them in the chat and we'll go ahead and address them. So one of the comments that came through when you were during your presentation was, those crashes appear remarkably close to no low fly zones and near over villages. And I was like, yeah, it really did.
Yeah, totally. And again, it sort of undermines I'm fascinated. I mentioned the challenge of doing this work, as myself, given my own positionality and distance from an understanding of the nation, and then using colonial documents. And so it's sort of like, if this is what the Air Force themselves are acknowledging, that says a lot about what's actually happening. And it also makes it really hard to take anything for me reading it, to take anything they say at face value, because there is this like amassing. I'm reading a colonial document, and in this colonial document, there's so much evidence about how the Air Force is perpetuating harm in a colonial document written in English. I mean, so to me, that's already like must be a fraction of what's actually experienced by O'odham
Mhm.
people. And then they're like, oh, and by the way, don't worry, we won't fly below 3,000 feet and we'll avoid these zones that we've said we've been avoiding. So yeah, I totally.
I think, and just from the clips that you put in, in your presentation, I'm shocked of how just like overtly they just dismissed the concern. They acknowledged and then dismissed it. And it was just that pattern, which is crazy to me. And we have another comment from Stephanie. I didn't know what overflights was happening. This is crazy to hear about, and then it took so long for to be revised. Do you know why only 50 people showed up for the second meeting?
I mean, I don't. I think that's why I'd like to do oral histories, because there are the folks I've talked to in the nation, like these flights are still going on. And so I think that's only gonna, there'll be a lot of information that um, I'll need that would require talking to folks who are living there, and I haven't done that yet. My only hunch, Stephanie, is that from the documents, I'm sure there's more there that requires working closer and talking with folks on the nation. But my hunch is just seeing how poorly that first process was handled. I mean, I was kind of I thought it was rather extraordinary that over 500 people came out, but then you get the like it takes 8 years. How are you dealing with transportation? There's some interpretation and translation, but there's the question of how much time the kernel takes up, whether people have to use comments. So just based on the written documents, my hypothesis would be that working with the Air Force was so exhausting, demoralizing. And you got people who showed up, right? Who did the emotional labor, relived the traumas, put their voices into this federal record, and then all for what? So that's sort of my interpretation from what I can read in the documents.
And then, and this probably relates back to your dissertation as a whole. Maria asked, do you know of any other tribes who may be experiencing the same issue?
Great. Yeah. There was really great work. I didn't mention it in the presentation, but I know that Tohono O'odham leaders began working with I think it would have been Jiccarilla Apache. I'd have to look back at the map, a few in southern New Mexico, when the Holloman Air Force Base was expanding its low altitude airspace. So there's also a pretty cool, or I just think powerful and important intertribal story. The Autumn are like fighting for their own airspace sovereignty, but then they were allying with the tribes affected by the Holloman Low Altitude Air Force Base. And then there's a big one on the map that I could go back to that overlays like 3 or 4 different tribes up, including Northern Cheyenne, Oglala Sioux, several of the Lakota and like Rosebud reservations in South Dakota. So that's one I'd like to study more about, but I haven't gotten much into it. Yeah, thank you for the question.
So we're getting a lot of like really good things coming through. So hold on, let me catch up to them for a second.
That's great.
Okay. And someone just put a comment, Marcelo, the sacred sites, an area to pray, etc. I don't know if they're making a comment or if they're just asking, like, were there any mentions to that in like the documents that you were going through?
Great. The 1990, I didn't see any in the environmental impact statements that I shared of those two hearings. The 1990 generalized impact statement, so that wasn't specific to the cells or the Autumn, that did acknowledge the particular impact on religion. And I think that what I'd be interested to learn more about that I haven't researched and didn't come up much in my current work is how the 1976 Religious Freedom Act, American Indian Religious Freedom, I think it's called, could be used or has been used, because that's been really powerful. Well, I mean, insofar that's been an area where tribes have been really savvy and successful in my experience more broadly with sacred sites and with regaining access and restricting extractive industry and other settler access. So that's a line of inquiry I'd like to pursue, and that I think, if is not currently being used, might be a successful tactic. So thank you for raising
And
that.
then so then another question that came through, and I will say, like, in the audience in the chat, when people are saying where they're coming from, we have a lot of folks coming from out of state, and so not everyone in our audience resides on the nation. So this person asked, the flights are still going on, question mark. So, like, are they still going on? So I'd like to touch on that, but then I'll let you go ahead and if you have anything to say for that question.
Yeah, no, Naomi, I'd love to hear your
Oh,
response. You more than I. Yeah, please.
oh. So and this is just my one personal experience. So I'm Donna Autumn. I did not grow up on the nation. I came back to the nation. In the type of I'm what they call an urban Indian. So I spent my weekends and holidays and summer vacations, with my family in Cells and in San Miguel. So during my childhood, never heard of it, never anything like that. Finished college and whatnot, came back home and started working. And I'll never forget this. I was working at Donna Autumn Community College, and I was in this big office space where we had like a bunch of cubicles. And I shared it with all the faculty, and everyone's in their cubicle during their work and whatnot. All of a sudden, I just hear this loud boom, and like the entire building shakes. I'm an easily startled person anyways. And I jumped and I was like, oh my gosh, what was that? And I just look around and I'm looking around and I was like, did nobody hear that? Like, what was that? And they're like, oh yeah, that happens. And everyone was just so used to like, oh, that happens, and I eventually got to that point. It was like, oh, again, and so I would say yes, but I have not heard them in a while, personally. But doesn't mean it doesn't happen, which makes me really interested in Ali, what is it, the document, the planned expansion, the 2022. If there's like a link to that or whatever, I would love to see that. Um, and I think there's a lot of, it makes me want to be able to go back now and ask like my grandmas and stuff, like my grandmas and aunties, what was your experience from that? Because I only know what my current is. And I will say my predecessor at Himdaki had let me know he had done some trainings at Luke Air Force Base, essentially just saying like, hey, we're here, we live here, we exist. We're a community, so don't just dismiss us. Don't think there's not people here. So, I know some of those things have happened. But yeah, I'll share. But anybody, please feel free to put comments and whatnot in the chat.
Yeah, and I'll pause for a minute to actually, I think I would love to hear from others who are there, who have more knowledge than I might. So I'll wait to see if anyone wants to respond to that.
Oh, there's a lot. Okay, I'm just going to go straight from in the order that we came to. So we might come back to that.
Sounds good.
Okay, so. Oh, and someone said, I understand they probably were fed up. And I think she was the one that made the comment like, do you know why there was only 50 people who came back for the second hearing? And I could see that, especially for so long, of a turnaround. Yeah. And then I have another comment. It says, or question, it says, relating to the Air Force testing on the Tohono O'odham lands, what's your opinion on the U.S. testing nuclear bombs in Nevada affecting a big nation known as the Navajo Nation?
Yeah, totally. Ooh, I mean the different kinds of ways that indigenous lands and bodies are militarized is just so disturbing, disgusting, heart-wrenching, painful, and it's ongoing. So I actually have a chapter. There's good work that's been done um, on that on Nevada test site, and I've read some of that, and it's important. And actually the Shoshone have done have done a lot of community organizing, so that I could share references about that. But my work, what I decided to write about, was actually a series of 254 detonations here at Los Alamos, because it's totally horrendous, and there's still a lot of repair that needs to occur. I mean, I don't even know how you repair that, but there's a lot that needs to occur at Nevada. But in my experience, that's fairly well known. And what I learned while I was doing my research is there were 254 open air detonations. And I found my way to these documents because of my study on air. The Los Alamos lab, they did these from 1943 to 1962, and they intentionally set them off when the wind would blow the debris over the surrounding pueblos, which border. I mean, the lab is on Pueblo land, and they still currently border the land, and it goes to the Rio Grande, which is the source of farming and water for all of those communities. So that was one that I wrote about because it had been overlooked. It had been overlooked in part because they were not full scale, so they were not as big as the ones in Nevada, but still full open air radioactive bombs that were detonated specifically when wind would disperse the harm over the surrounding indigenous and Nuevo Mexican communities. So that's one example that I have studied that I feel like is important to shed light on. And the ongoing work at Nevada Test Site is horrendous. There's also the cradle to grave issue of nuclear waste. So Yucca Mountain, right, was going to be that in Nevada, of then bringing the waste back after the site had already been so decimated by nuclear testing. After Yucca Mountain was shut down, they now have done the WIP here in southern New Mexico. So we collect waste and pipe it way down, and so there's New Mexico is one state that does the cradle to grave. So this state has been responsible for developing and detonating nuclear weapons, and then it's also responsible for the mining uranium, which also really affects the Navajo or Dene communities as well as different Pueblo communities. So there's a lot of environmental justice issues to be had. And I will say one thing, just a little shout out. I haven't seen it yet, and I'm not sure how I'll feel about Oppenheimer, but it has been cool to see. And I can also share the link that a group called Tewa Women United has put out some really wonderful educational materials combating or shedding light on other parts of the story that the movie overlooks. So those are just a few different kind of resources and parts of the story of nuclear waste, but it's ongoing, and there's really important activists that are fighting it at the moment. Yeah.
Wow. Makes me want to watch it now.
Yeah, I'll drop this. I'll drop this in the chat because I'm like, okay, now that I've seen the way that they've responded, I also want to see the critique. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, so the next one, it says, this was incredibly interesting, and I loved hearing the names of the community members who spoke up at these meetings. They are still community members who represent their communities in different capacities today. I've only heard about their earlier years of being strong voiced members. And I will say, it is really nice to see familiar names. And it just
That's
makes my heart happy.
Oh, I'm so glad, and yeah, like I said, really hoping to do another phase of the work where I might be able to speak with those folks or folks who know them or their family members, because it's really, I just find it really I find it powerful, and I think about what it means to read their voices, and the really clear protests. I think it's incredibly important that history is known and shared, and so thanks for that comment.
And I will say, and this, because I know you joined us for our last lecture with Judge Harvey, and I know my interactions with Judge Harvey with his work, like he was able to, and this is, when I took his class and we were able to get into like more detailed discussions of his presentation, he was able to make ties to the people who he was showing in his presentations and who they were related to, like in our class. And he almost gave all of us like our family tree in relation to the people that he was talking about. And like, it makes me curious. And I'm seeing some names on here. I'm like, I was like, I wonder what like his story about these individuals are and whatnot. So,
Oh, yeah,
um,
that's fabulous.
okay, so the next one, it says the low overflights happen to this day. It would be great to get an update from the new Tohono O'odham Nation administration. Um, I agree, and that comes from Miss Beverly. You met her.
She's so great. Go Beverly. And yeah,
Yes.
I totally agree. Yeah.
And okay, next one is I recently moved from NW. Oh, Northwest. Sorry, I just should have read the rest of that sentence. I was thinking it was a state, and I was like, I don't know that state. Oh, sorry. I recently moved from northwest of Phoenix, Luke Air Force Base, where they trained pilots to fly F-16s and F-35 fighter jets. We regularly heard these fly over, often rattling our house. Here in Green Valley, Arizona, south of Tucson, we have heard very few overflights.
Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that. I think that's like a how these airspaces cover so much territory but are concentrated. Again, I think the airspace and air is a really crucial environmental justice issue that hasn't gotten as much attention, and that sharing that experience affirms to me that it really is localized over some communities more than others.
And I will say, so I grew up in and around all of the Phoenix area, mainly in Levine. I went to Tolleson High School, so if you know like the geography of the state, so that's like on the way towards Luke Air Force Base out that way. And so I know a lot of people who kind of lived in and around that area, and that's kind of like a known hazard if you live close to the Air Force Base. Like, yes, you're going to be hearing those things, and it's like one of those, you know, it going into it almost to an extent, but like how on the nation and just having like the hearing hazards, it's not nearly the same as like hearing the sonic booms out of nowhere when you're nowhere near Air Force Base. It's very, yeah, it's kind
I
of
appreciate
scary.
I appreciate that point actually. Yeah, that's really helpful in terms of like what you know to expect versus the sudden surprise of it. Yeah.
And now let's see. Navajo and other indigenous nations in Arizona are still dealing with uranium mines, many now abandoned. Yes, it's very much. I don't know if any of that came along in because I know you do like airspace, but I mean it seems like it's could be the literature is though could be really closely tied.
Yeah, it absolutely is, and is still such an ongoing challenge. I think it's for in my work, it's just tied really clearly to the development of nuclear weapons and nuclear testing, which is a really important part of this. And then there's a really useful book by Tracy Lynn Boyles called Wastelanding about these mines, and I really appreciate, I think it came out in 2015, but it's just a really excellent study of the environmental injustices of uranium mines, especially the way that they affect Navajo Diné communities. But she really built out this very clear theory, and I think there's something similar happening with the air, that these places are turning them into wastelands that are empty, or don't have resources, is how the justification of their extraction and the harm that accompanies it is undertaken. So it's a really important story as well.
Uh, And it's interesting in doing this, just the entire lecture series, really, all of us, we all, I'd say at Kentucky, we all have our individualized, specialized areas, the things that we like to study and that get us excited. But I'm also very much an educator as a person, and which means like I get interested in everything and I want to read everything and I want to know everything. And so like you've just introduced like this entire another body of literature. It's like, oh my gosh, I know nothing about it. I want to learn more about it. I want to understand. Um, yeah, it's just a little bit of that excitement. And then so Bob, he was the person who commented about the Luke Air Force Base earlier. He says, yes, when we bought our house near Luke Air Force Base, we had to acknowledge its proximity to the associated noise. And so like there's the acknowledgement of the associated noise. However, like in the hearing that you were talking about, I wrote this down. It says what their comments to like um, the complaints and the concerns of what was happening is like, yes, noise is annoying. And I was like, that's so not the same thing.
Totally. It feels like a slap in, I mean, it almost, to me, reading that feels like it would have been better to just ignore it. It's like such a gross backhanded, way of, it's like to just either say it's fine or acknowledge the harm, but to call it an annoyance just feels really particularly kind of manipulative and gross and twisting, like it's twisting noise. And I think that's why the emphasis on really psychological warfare and the comments from the Vietnam vet. I mean, that's like to me how much, and again, this is in a colonial document that Air Force solicits. And there's that clear of an acknowledgement, like this is you're turning this nation into a war zone. And weirdly, they're never touching the land. So again, that's I think the other piece that interests me about the research is sovereignty, like taking air sovereignty seriously. And there's legal precedent for that as well. So yeah.
And and just so my background is more in like in history, and I know I don't remember which document this was or whatnot, but this was like when I was in college, and I know I had this discussion with a professor before. Is the Donna Autumn, we're fortunate in a lot of ways, and it's not. And one of the ways that I'll say that I feel like we're fortunate is because we had the ability to stay on our ancestral lands. We are in a place where we have always been, and that is such a blessing that not other indigenous people have that. We weren't relocated, for the most part, but part of the reason why that is because we were viewed, by um, by the federal government as like our own barrier. Like no one, like they didn't think like we would just, weed ourselves out because we couldn't live there and things like that. And they were wrong, so therefore they have to continue to deal with us, But yet they still treat us in this way of like, well, we're just going to keep doing what we're doing, and eventually they'll just go away. But we're not going to go away. And I loved hearing those comments. Oh, I didn't write it down, but there was the one comment. It's like, yes, you're going to be here till the eternity, but like, so are we.
Yeah.
That
Eugene
made me
and
very happy.
totally. Yeah.
Yeah. Let's see, what else do we have? Okay, it says overflights over cities are probably far less impactful than overflights in cells over the cells MOA. Yeah.
I would think, yeah, I mean, in that case, it's probably is closer to the noise pollution problem. And you're like, okay, there's other kinds of noise, but also you don't get sonic booms over cities. I mean, it's very telling to me that after 1964, all of a sudden sonic booms disappeared over cities and then have continued to this day over the Tohono O'odham Nation or in cells. So,
And I know we're getting close to the end, so I'm just going to share something that like my the staff at the museum when your presentation was coming out before, not with us, I think it was the Smithsonian.
that's right. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, so I know you stopped by. I didn't get to see you to advertise your flyer and whatnot. Thank you so much for inviting us to attend, and there was quite a few of us who were able to. I know we were talking about it once, and it just reminded me. I'm not a person who follows like the royal family or anything by any means, but what's the one with the red hair? Prince Harry.
Uh-huh.
His book came out during that time, and I was like, oh, I commute a great distance, and so I started to listen to it, and I was like, I had a free like credit, so I purchased it and I listened to it. But he was trained as a pilot, and part of his training, I think, was at Luke Air Force Base, but I know for sure he talked about his training over Arizona, and he talked about like over the desert, and like it was just so open. It wasn't like an entire section. It was like maybe a paragraph, if that, of his comments of his perception of where he did his training because there was nobody there. And I was just like, wow. And in my head, I was like, was he responsible for some sonic
Right.
booms? But that's the thought that went through my head.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing that. No, I didn't know that.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Yeah. So if you ever get a chance to listen to his book or read it, I would look for that section.
I'm totally curious. Yeah. Thanks.
And not even the entire book. That's the only part that sticks out to me. Like I said, I'm not one of those who are fascinated with the royals, but and so let's see. Oh, thank you. So there's a comment that says thank you to Hindaki for presenting these summer virtual lectures. So it is our pleasure. I'm very glad that we were able to provide continued programming, online programming, especially since it's summertime and we have like the rain. the rains that have been coming and being able to stay inside, hopefully with some AC, and then also being able to engage our audiences that are coming from a distance. I would say one of the things that I've learned over the pandemic is we have so many people, relatives that live great distance, and to be able to be engaged in our communities in this way, I hope to be able to continue to offer those. Okay, and it looks like we're going through things. Says, thank you to you for sharing this sad and fascinating history of USAF impacts to the Tohono O'odham Nation. Prince Harry trained and stayed at Gila Bend Air Force Base, causing us to postpone our site visit. I didn't know that. Wow.
That's wild.
More things you. Oh, you're very welcome.
It's really a wonderful lecture series, and yeah, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. So,
Well, it looks like we're dying down. We have one more lecture by Dr. Giselle Ramon. She's from Santa Vera District. She'll be presenting next Wednesday, same time. I hope you all can join us. I'm very excited to be able to present her as well. And she'll be concluding our series. Any last minute, anything, Ali?
no, just a huge thanks, and I hope to be able to continue the work, and yeah, really appreciate everyone's attention and for sharing more about how you experience this today. So,
Alrighty, well, we'll go ahead and close it out. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ali, for joining us. And I look forward to being in touch with you soon.
same. Thanks, Naomi. Have a great night.
Bye. You too.
Bye, everyone.